Hey everyone, my name's Chip and I'm the pastor here at Union Church. And on behalf of our church family, we want to greet you, whether you're in a living room, on an exercise bike, or on your phone over breakfast. What a blessing it is that it's 2020 and we can stay connected this way. In these times we're facing together, it's very easy to feel overwhelmed. What makes COVID 19 so insidious and so overwhelming is that we want to face challenges in our life by fight or flight. Sometimes we want to fight, and those things we can't fight, we want to flee from. But the fact that we can't really do either right now is pretty overwhelming. In the midst of this pandemic, so much is outside our control. And that's why having a relationship with God is so important. What God invites us to do together is trust in His powerful goodness for our sense of well being, rather than trusting our own ability to control our circumstances. I have been amazed in chatting with Christians on the phone or over Zoom how much your trust in God has been strengthened these last few weeks. This is it, guys. This is why we walk with God. Because when it all gets to be too much, we have a wonderful God who stands beside us, and we can trust that He's strong when we are weak. He's good when we're selfish. And most importantly, He's trustworthy and unchanged, even when everything else in the world is changing. That's the invitation from God we find in Mark 10 together. God invites you to trust in His powerful goodness, especially when you're overwhelmed. We're going to unpack that invitation to trust God's power through blight, flight, fight, and might. Again, that's blight, flight, fight, and might. First, in verses 32 to 34 of Mark 10, blight. Now, what we're about to read doesn't hit directly on a pandemic. You can go back to Mark 1, where Jesus heals a man with leprosy if you want to know specifically how to think about caring for the sick as a Christian. But what Jesus does touch on throughout the entire Gospel of Mark and here in chapter 10 is that same sense of dread we're experiencing right now at the coming suffering of death. What is causing each of us to reevaluate our priorities right now is that dread of death. Bank accounts can recover, new businesses can be started, but the great blight that all of us face is death. Beginning to read at Mark 10, verse 32. They were on their way up to Jerusalem, with Jesus leading the way. And the disciples were astonished, while those who followed were afraid. Again, he took the 12 aside and told them what was going to happen. We are going up to Jerusalem, he said, and the Son of Man will be betrayed to the chief priests and teachers of the law. They will condemn him to death and will hand him over to the Gentiles, who will mock him and spit on him, flog him, and kill him. 3 days later, he will rise. This is something we've heard before. We heard it in Mark chapter 8 and then Mark 9. This is actually Palm Sunday, and as we enter into Holy Week, we're remembering again that Jesus' whole life aims toward the cross. We're going to hear it again next week. Jesus, God Himself, enters into our place of suffering and dies. This is good news for each of us who are suffering from the fear of the blight of death. We're in the church season of Lent, which if you hang around the church for any period of time, you'll hear me say is a reminder, you're gonna die. Or as Thanos says in the Avengers movie, dread it, run from it, destiny arrives all the same. And now it's here. Or should I say, I am. This is a particular edge when we realize Thanos' name means death. We do so much to insulate ourselves from the reality of death, but it finds us nonetheless. One of my deepest privileges as a pastor is getting to walk alongside families who've lost a loved one. Each funeral is a reminder to me that our great enemy is death. We have petty disputes in this life. We sometimes let those blow up into larger divisions. But the great blight upon the face of our whole human family is death. One response to the blight of death is flight. Continuing to read in Mark chapter 10, verses 35 to 37. Then James and John, the sons of Zebedee, came to him. Teacher, they said, we want you to do for us whatever we ask. What do you want me to do for you? He asked. They replied, let one of us sit at your right and the other at your left in your glory. The disciples here are stand-ins for you and me. And what they demonstrate is that sometimes when we face an insurmountable obstacle, we want to flee. We want to run away and escape. For a lot of us as Christians, we think this is what Christian faith is all about going to be with Jesus when I die, or ascending to the pearly gates, or leaving this world to go to a better one. In direct response to Jesus saying he is going to be condemned and die, his followers' initial instinct in verse 37 is to ask, let us sit at your right and your left in glory. But friends, this is an error. God does not want us to flee the good world he has made. He has put us on this earth for a purpose. You are where you are right now for a reason. And that reason is to undo the blight of this awful evil death on the face of God's good earth. Can you imagine that if Jesus decided to flee rather than go to the cross himself? If he realized that death was running amok and that meant he was going to be in harm's way, and that rather than facing it, he had just said, nah, I'm good, and hurried back to glory. Jesus didn't flee from death, but instead he faced it, even though he knew what he was going to happen to him. The other response we often have to the blight of death is to fight. Mark 10, verse 41 tells us, when the 10 heard about this, they became indignant with James and John. Jesus called them together and said, you know that those who are regarded as rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their high officials exercise authority over them. Not so with you. It initially seems like an overreaction for Jesus to come down harsh on his disciples, particularly the ones that were upset at James and John. Weren't James and John being greedy? Sure, they were. But if flight is the wrong instinct, Jesus also tells us that fighting, overcoming suffering is a wrong instinct too. The instinct to fight seems to be at first a good one. But there are no lasting victories with the sword. None of us can beat death. Not forever anyway. The cup Jesus drinks on the cross, each of his disciples in turn will drink. We learn James died at the hand of Herod in the book of Acts. We're not sure how John dies, but we know how most of the other disciples die. And the great lesson to be learned from the early church is what took Greek and Roman soldiers hundreds of years to build, these empires that we study in school. Jesus conquers with a few dozen servants and without ever taking a life. So if not flight and not fight, how are we supposed to face a blight? Are we just supposed to roll up in a ball and await the inevitable? Jesus introduces a third way, and that's God's might. Mark 10:43 goes on. Instead, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be first must be slave of all. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. Right before the coronavirus struck in the States, I was out at a wedding in Los Angeles, and one of the bridesmaids I was chatting with is a doctor in New York City. I was impressed with her humility and also her Christian faith. And it was only after the fact that I learned she's the head of liver transplants at New York Presbyterian. So what that means is she's a very good doctor. And we were talking about the coming pandemic. But because of her faith, she was expressing how she wasn't overwhelmed. Instead, she was getting prepared and ready and even excited to serve. I've, of course, been thinking about her and praying for her these last couple weeks. How does she put herself in harm's way without fleeing or fighting? How do all our nurses and all the heroes we're seeing on the news? For that matter, how do we? Well, I think in order to answer that question, we have to look back to how Jesus did it. See, the truth isn't that some of us are stronger than others by nature, or that some of us have personalities better suited to deal with reality. No. The key is that we need to trust in the might of our God. Jesus went to the cross, and he faced death head on without fighting it or fleeing from it, without trying to sugarcoat the situation like his friends. Because what he had was a perfect trust in the love of his Father. He had perfect faith in his Father's powerful goodness to preserve him. He gave his life as a ransom for many because he knew only God could overcome death. And Jesus' trust in God's perfect goodness to overcome his death and to resurrect him into new life. This is a gift for us. Being a Christian's friends means that existential dread that one day you will breathe your last is gone. Friends, death is not the end. The sting of death is sin. But Christ's trust in God has taken all that away. Christ died on the cross, but he also rose from the dead. And here at the foot of Christ's cross is a promise from God to you that God is still both good and powerful. Return to that place this week when you're tempted to run, when you're tempted to lash out and fight, when you're tempted to say, it's every man for himself, or I have to get mine. Remember, friends, Jesus offers you a third way. Neither fight nor fight, but instead a deep and abiding trust in God's